important command and staff positions throughout his illustrious career. We're also honored to count both General Breedlove and General Clark as Atlanta Council Board Directors. Before I turn it over to our moderator, I want to encourage all of you to follow the discussion on Twitter by following @AC Scowcroft and @AC Eurasia. To join the conversation and ask questions of our panelists, please just use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen on Zoom or tweet your questions using the hashtag #StrongerWithAllies. With that, I'll turn the floor over to the Scowcroft Center's Deputy Director of Transatlantic Security Initiative, Leah Schoeneman. Thank you all for joining us.
Hello all, good morning and good afternoon for those chiming in from around the world. I'm Leah Schoeneman. I'm the Deputy Director of the Transatlantic Security Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. I'm very pleased to welcome not one but two former Supreme Allied Commanders for Europe, General Breedlove and General Clark. As SACEURs, you were both dual-hatted as the commander for the United States European Command, reporting to the North Atlantic Council at NATO, as well as the US President and Secretary of Defense. So I'll ask if you could please keep your SACEUR hats on as much as possible this morning to help our global viewers understand the options available to NATO at this time and not just the United States. I think that would be really helpful to add to the discussion that's ongoing in all capitals right now. I think the credibility of NATO is being challenged today to an extent that it hasn't seen since 2014. And after the stresses of the last few years on transatlantic unity, I am very worried. The Russian military buildup is happening in the context of years of increasingly aggressive Russian actions and violations. And this current crisis is more than about Ukraine. And it's not just a highbrow discussion amongst elites. There are real consequences. As many as 14,000 people have died in the Russia-Ukraine conflict since 2014. And actions NATO could take have a real impact on warfighters and citizens alike. So it's not just a discussion we're having between those of us who get to sit around and talk in think tanks. We just hosted the NATO Secretary General a few moments ago, and you can watch the recording of that online and on our social media feeds as well. He noted the commitment between NATO allies' views on defending NATO members, which is strong, but defending Ukraine is a different matter. The SecGen stressed that NATO allies are ready to impose heavy political and economic sanctions. He also noted that if Russia wants less NATO troops on their border, then they have achieved the exact opposite. So given that, I wanted to start off with what sounds like a pointed question, but I think it's actually too broad to answer in several hours, let alone the short hour that we have here together. So General Clark, start with you and then General Breedlove. Is NATO effectively deterring Russia right now?
Well, we won't know the answer to that until we see the conclusion of the crisis. But it's clear that NATO is demonstrating resolve. And as long as NATO stays unified and the allies pull together, it's more important than having the difference between 8,500 troops and 10,000 troops or whatever. It's the fact of NATO unity that is the power to deter conflict in Europe. It may not deter Putin. He may simply want a show of force to demonstrate his military capabilities, or he may, through subversion or something else, take over Ukraine covertly, and it could collapse. But the point is that NATO, his demands were directed at NATO, not just Ukraine, and NATO has stood up to those demands very firmly. So right now, I'd say NATO is you can't say it has deterred. You can say it has overcome the challenge that Putin has thrown at it thus far. And we're looking strong, and we can see a path outward from this in which NATO is strengthened and more successful than ever as in its mission as a result of Mr. Putin's aggression and buildup against Ukraine.
Great, thank you, sir. That's a great lead in to following questions that I definitely want to pick up on. So General Breedlove, over to you, sir.
So first of all, I'm in violent agreement with General Clark, especially in the context of this immediate problem. So allow me then to expand the question just a little bit. Are we deterring Russia? In many ways, we are not. If you look at what some call the gray zone war or the hybrid war, what Mr. Gerasimov calls active measures, we are not deterring Russia. Russia is attacking us in these areas in America, in our capital, in every capital in Europe, and across Europe in these gray zone areas. So there are places we are absolutely not deterring Russia. But I agree with General Clark. In this immediate instance, I think that as several now have stated, the solidarity of the alliance in facing this challenge is critical, and we're doing well at that so far. And the good news is the Russians are still willing to come to the table and talk, as they, I think, have been surprised by the solidarity in this response. So I think we need to work on the other deterrence factors as well.
That's really helpful to hear. Thank you both for that opening salvo. I think, kind of following on the news that we've seen just as of yesterday, the U.S. has stated, and there have been reports as well on the phone call between Biden and Zelensky, that the United States sees every indication that Putin is going to use military force between now and the middle of February. So assuming beyond hybrid and beyond these sort of gray zone tactics that we've already seen them, as you stated, General Breedlove, using against all sorts of NATO allies and partners for years now. We're watching these public reports of various equipment flowing in, and importantly, what many analysts are pointing to as key enablers like medical support and logistical support, as proof of how seriously Moscow is preparing for a conventional military attack. But their forces are also very dispersed right now. So I'm curious, both of you, given your expansive expertise on these matters, what indicators would you point us towards to demonstrate Putin's intent right now?
Yeah, Phil, you want me to start on this? So first of all, you see the positioning of the forces. Secondly, you see the sort of live fire, what we would call live fire training. The tanks are firing, the artillery's firing. When you move armored vehicles and they have weapon systems on them, in order to launch, you have to be able to make sure those weapon systems are still calibrated or zeroed. And so there would be these kind of exercises going on. So that's one indicator. We know that there's active reconnaissance and subversion efforts coming across the border of Ukraine. That's a second indicator. We know that there's been a false flag effort that's been exposed by the British, that there have been a wave of cyber attacks. 3 days ago, we saw a relatively ineffective civil disobedience effort that was directed at overrunning the parliament building in Kyiv. Now, we don't know whether it was supposed to be 500,000 people in the street and a reverse Maidan, and it was just ineffective, or whether it was a rehearsal for something that might come later. But all of these are indicators. You can't expect that a Russian attack is going to necessarily be like Pearl Harbor, where suddenly airplanes come over and missiles and everything blows up. I certainly wouldn't do it that way, and I'm sure that General Breedlove would agree with me. You want to penetrate, soften up, confuse, obfuscate, cause chaos, and then you come in to rescue and save civil society. And so you have to look very carefully at this conversation between President Zelensky and President Biden yesterday. There's been some disinformation out on that already that said that it wasn't a good conversation. Now, I don't believe that. I think that's disinformation. But we do have to understand that President Zelensky can't be put in a position where he generates panic in his own country. So he's going to naturally play down the threat as long as possible. The worst thing that could happen is 1 million Ukrainians are frightened and take to the highways and try to come out through Hungary or Slovakia or Romania. Well, that would really be chaotic, and it would serve Putin's purpose. So there's going to be, when you see this disinformation coming out, you know this is part of the strategy. It's not a bolt from the blue. This is already a strategy of attacking Ukraine. Those are the indicators. And the buildup of the forces just reinforces that.
No, thank you for that. I think my pen ran out of ink trying to write that all down at the same time. So thank you, General Clark. General Breedlove, I'm sure you have a lot of thoughts as well.
In agreement again, let me add a few specifics on what General Clark mentioned at the end, the forces. So several weeks ago, 2 to 3 weeks ago, at the beginning of this business, we saw Russian formations parked administratively, big, totally non-tactical formations, easy to see from space, easy to see by reporters, and it was largely, I think, strategic messaging. And what I am worried about now is we see those forces dispersing into more tactical formations. We see exercising, as General Clark has mentioned, and even more telling, we begin to see the enablers that the Russians wouldn't see arriving, hospital formations, fuel bladders, logistics trains, ammunition, all of those things now coming forward to marry to those fielded forces. So completely agree with what General Clark has said, and just in a very narrow view of what's actually happening with the Russian forces, we're beginning to see the move from an administrative, possibly coercive force to a force that is still coercive, but could be more tactically relevant.
So following up on that, and again, I know I'm treading old ground. There's been a lot of analysis in the past few weeks, and especially the past few days. There was a really great report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies examining 6 scenarios for a possible Russian invasion. Here at the Atlantic Council, we hosted an event on Tuesday. It feels like eons ago already. Examining different scenarios as well and adding a few more options to consider on top of that. But I'm curious, again, from your perspectives, based on the indicators that we were just speaking about, how do you think that the first 24 hours of a Russian operation would go? And this is also wrapped up, obviously, in Putin's political aims. What sort of operation do you think he would undertake right now that would have the most political gain, given as well the NATO solidarity that we have seen, including on our stage this morning?
So I think General Clark made some really good points before. There are some individuals who believe we're going to look at, as was described, this big blitzkrieg. First of all, I don't think he has enough force to mount a huge blitzkrieg, and some are saying to try to take everything east of the Dnieper River. I don't think these are I'm not as sanguine with those options that are out there. But Mr. Putin has built a force that gives him multiple options. And I'm sure General Clark will add more, but I kind of look at 3 big groupings, and all 3 of what I discussed are embedded in almost everybody else's. You know, he's got a group of forces that are in the north that could literally go due west and never encounter Ukraine, and no body bags going home. And that force would be a huge coercive force sitting in the north, very near Kyiv, in the Belarusian side. And I believe that force might be aimed at deposing Zelensky, as we have talked about, so that he can put his cronies in there. There's those forces and forces in the center directly across from Donbass that could go into Donbass and not even cross the line of contact and make a big show out of armored formations entering into Ukraine. And while that also is aimed at the Zelensky government, I think it's personally aimed at the NATO and the European Union, a force that would say, we're here, we're in charge. You're not here, you're irrelevant. And then I see a force in the center and in the south that is, I believe, designed to have the capability to run along the coast to something we've long called the land bridge to Crimea. But there's a couple of important points that force would be after. First of all, the port of Mariupol. Not my numbers. Other people say these numbers, but some say that Mariupol represents 20% of the GDP of Ukraine. And if that force then carried forward to the northern part of Crimea, it could seize the water supplies that Russia needs so critically for Crimea. And others think maybe it goes on to Odessa or whatever. But what I see in that southern force is sort of an economic crippling of Ukraine, again, aimed at the government of Ukraine and others. But I'm sure Wes has got some other ideas, but I see that Mr. Putin has built options. And I don't think he has enough force to do all the options at the same time, but he could certainly do a couple of them and cause serious, serious problems for the men and women, soldiers, and citizens of Ukraine.
Yeah, I agree with everything you're saying, Phil, and those are certainly the options. Now, but in response to the question, think of this. What Mr. Putin would like to do is come in as a peacemaker or peacekeeper. So it may actually, the first 24 hours might involve major demonstrations in Kyiv. The traditional way something like this happens is the president, if he doesn't want to concede, is kidnapped and disappeared. Somebody comes up and said, the president has had a heart attack, but I'm taking charge here to establish order. And then the radio and television stations are seized. There's a big blackout of the internet. A cyber attack hits the power grid and people are confused. We know that there are Russian agents all through the Ukrainian government, probably inside their forces. These people suddenly start misdirecting traffic, changing the addressees on messages, sending confusing reports. This unit should move to this location and block. Turns out that's the very location the real Ukrainians are trying to move through. So if he can create that kind of confusion, then everything else is much easier. The one thing that we didn't mention thus far is the effective use of precision strike. We know the Russians have the same, maybe better, precision strike that we do. They have the Caliber cruise missiles. They have the Iskander missiles. They have the ability with their SA-400s to completely eliminate any Ukrainian air activity that comes against them. Whether they can coordinate all that and so forth, probably not very well. Maybe only to the 70–80% level. There'll be maybe a couple of Russian airplanes shot down by SA-400s, but they can mass combat power and in a lightning strike, take out much of the Ukrainian defense assets, especially if they're not mobilized and dispersed. And this is the dilemma that President Zelensky will face. Once he disperses those assets, calls on the assembly, then you can't say the attack might not happen. And then you've got people going in every direction. And so he'll be reluctant to do that until the last minute. And so therefore they present targets. The Russians have the ability with their long range missiles and their reconnaissance. They have the same space reconnaissance that we do. And the electronic intelligence may be even better for all we know. They know where everything is. And then boom, 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 boom. In a few minutes, if it's well coordinated, he will have achieved shock and awe. And I've always felt, as we were saying, none of us really know what Mr. Putin thinks, but we do know that he's watched for over 20 years as the United States Air Force has demonstrated shock and awe. And General Breedlove was part of that in many different iterations. And so it generates a wave of intimidation. We know that after we went into Iraq in 2003, there was a period for several months where the Iranian government was like, oh my God, they're going to turn on us and we need to make nice to the Americans. Unfortunately, we didn't take advantage of it at the time. But he expects that if it comes to this will shake the governments in the neighboring countries so that they will be more accommodating to Russia, not to mention what happens in Georgia.
Thank you. Please.
If I could, just a short 2-minute pile on, because Wes brings up some incredibly important things. And one of the things that concerns me the most is, yes, the Ukrainian ground forces have significantly improved since 13 and 14 in many ways. But I'm not so sanguine that the Ukraine Air Force and the Ukraine Navy can make the same adjustments. And that's very worrying. As General Clark has outlined nicely, the ability to deliver precise strike is going to be a real problem for Ukraine. And frankly, they are not going to be able to defend their sovereign airspace against a dedicated Russian attack. The same goes for at sea. The Ukrainian Navy is not going to be able to stand in the event of a dedicated Russian attack in the maritime spaces. And they will not be able to defend their sovereign coast and other places. And these are all big problems in the grand scheme of things for the Ukrainian president and his military.
So both of you have outlined some really drastic scenarios and then multiple different options within that. What's striking to me is how much of this is available in the open source internet and Twitter and Telegram, and this information is everywhere. We're all getting so flooded with this information. Based on that, and with your SACEUR hats on a little bit, what accounts in your mind for the different views amongst NATO allies on the crisis right now? You know, the British and the US are the only ones to have given the orders, notably for our personnel, follow-on personnel at the embassy in Kiev to evacuate. No other Europeans have taken that step. There's obviously a lot of political divides on how to support Ukraine right now, but focusing a little bit in on the threat assessment. You know, you're both reading very strongly into the threat assessment, and I would definitely agree with you. But why are there so many European NATO allies who are in disagreement, or at least not publicly in agreement with us?
Wes, if I could bring up an example here real quick. So when Russia first went into Crimea, do you remember the discussion of the little green men? For days and for weeks, some of our allies said, we don't see it the same way. These are we think they're locals, and et cetera, et cetera. And that was all happening because there were individual national interests that were playing out, and they were really worried. One country was trying to sell billions of dollars of ships to Russia, and they didn't want anything to mess with that. So every nation has got things playing out. And then, you know, later when some of these things were resolved, the ships were being sold other places and all kinds of things across some of the nations, all of a sudden now we're in agreement about who the little green men were. We knew that these nations knew the truth. The nations knew that we knew the truth. The nations knew that we knew that they knew the truth, et cetera, et cetera. This was just a drama to allow nations to work out their issues. And we have similar things now. Energy politics, the Nord Stream 2, the dependency of some of these nations on European energy and other things in economical terms. These are things that nations have to play out as they look at their support to the larger picture. So I'm sorry, Wes, for jumping in, but I mean, history tends to repeat itself, doesn't it? And now we see the same sort of drama as we had when Russia first invaded Crimea.
Oh, you did it very well, Phil, and I totally agree with what you said. Look, these nations are democracies, and we have to respect their public opinion. I mean, exactly. It sounds, scurrilous that they would want to sell amphibious ships to Russia, and therefore they wouldn't admit that there was an invasion. But these people who are making the ships are important domestic supporters for the governments. And so, we have our own interests in this government. Don't think that politics doesn't influence foreign policy. It influences it everywhere. And in democracies, if your foreign policy wasn't responsive to your public opinion and your interests at home, it wouldn't have any basis in legitimacy. It's a wonderful thing to have allies, and we believe in democracies, and so we have to understand sometimes it's inconvenient. But eventually, they will come together, and this is the way it's always been in NATO. General Eisenhower was the first Supreme Allied Commander. General Breedlove and I sat at his desk when we were Supreme Allied Commanders, and his first report to President Truman was, the French and the British, they're not doing enough. They promised they'd have these forces ready, and they're not doing it because they were involved in colonial wars in Asia. And, this has been a long-standing problem with NATO, and yet these nations rely on us. They can play their domestic politics out because they know we are strong. We have the intelligence. They will come around as required. We always believe that, and so far they have for us in NATO.
And if I could just pile on to that "we" comment, because it's I think General Clark and almost every other SACEUR would agree that at some time in their term, it's our capital and our nation who have been a little bit difficult to work with. So this is all about all of us. I couldn't agree more.
Thank you. It's very helpful to hear the history repeating itself, or at least rhyming enough that we're able to continue referencing it here in our events today. I'm curious, NATO nations have taken some response very publicly. Again, I'm sure that there are many options still under considerations and the closed door discussions happening in Brussels and beyond. I'm envious that I'm not listening to them, but also don't envy the people who are in those positions trying to make those decisions right now. So from the outside, wonder if you could comment on what you think the impact would be of the recently announced military posture moves from the United States, putting units on higher preparedness to deploy, France announcing that they would send troops to Romania, the Netherlands, Denmark, Spain, all ponying up assets or putting units on higher deployable readiness. What do you think that this shifts in the Russian calculus? Is this better deterring? Is it a signal more than anything? Maybe we'll start with General Clark.
I think it is a signal that NATO is more resolved. Doesn't change their calculus on what they can do in Ukraine one bit. If you want to change that calculus, you have to go back to 1950 and the US intervention in Korea after the North Koreans attacked. We had declared that South Korea was not in our defense perimeter. And so the North Koreans, perhaps taking advantage of that, went to Stalin, they went to Mao, and they said, we want to overrun the South. And the Chinese told them, well, you better be careful because the Americans are unpredictable and they still might intervene. Sure enough, President Truman ordered the intervention. Now, those 101st Airborne troops that might get deployed to Poland with attack helicopters and so forth, they're not going to intervene. But if you wanted to create ambiguity, if you want to really change the Russian calculus, you deploy a composite air wing with F-22s and F-35s. And Phil, I'm on your terrain here, so you're going to have to talk a little more about this. But you would deploy those to, let's say, Romania. And then they're flying combat air patrols over Romania, out over the Black Sea. They're the backstop for NATO. You see, if the Russians did come in with this massive air offensive, you can be sure that they wouldn't hesitate to buzz Romania and Slovakia and sort of waggle their wings if they did nothing more than that to sort of beat their chests. The Russian military is arrogant and full of itself because it's got new equipment. It's been successful in Syria. It knows how the US Air Force operates. It works with it. It works with the Israeli Air Force. And so if you really want to change the Russian calculus, you have to create the ambiguity of having an air capability that's right there, that's first rate, they're not sure that they wouldn't have an encounter with NATO, and they better be careful, because if they do, they're going to lose. And so that's the way you would really change, and we haven't done this yet. It may be under consideration, don't know, but we haven't done it yet.
As an airman, I'm sitting up straighter in my seat. Let me take just a tiny different tack, but I totally agree with what was just said. But also, if you read the two documents that were provided to us by Russia, what is one of the complaints? Is one of the fears that Mr. Putin and Lavrov and others have put in those papers? And that is they don't want more forces and equipment and weapons in the forward area. So maybe what we're doing is sending a message that your intransigence, this completely contrived crisis that you have put forward, is now going to cause the very thing you're trying to correct by us moving more force into the forward area. And so I think that it's a good message in reply.
I think building off of this too, something that we've been talking about a lot, as you can expect in the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, is also looking at what the force laydown currently is for NATO, including specifically U.S. forces. The U.S. obviously is undergoing their own national security strategy review right now and the national defense strategy, and maybe I can ask you to comment on that a little bit later, but they've also undergone a global posture review that didn't have very huge conclusions for the European region besides pausing the the moves out of Germany that had already been announced were being paused. So what can the United States do, and other NATO allies, to the extent that they have the sort of capacity that you're referencing, what can they do with what's already in theater? Move it further eastward? Are there rotations that we can be making use of that are already going to places like Lakenheath and Vicenza, and rotating them through Romania and Bulgaria? These sort of options that don't require, the readiness of huge units in the United States and massive deployments that could also take some time.
Phil, you want to take that?
I'll jump on this one first if you'd like. Yes, you kind of answered your own question a little bit. There are a lot of things that the U.S. European commander can do internal with his own forces. In 14, while the NAC was debating whether we should take some actions on air policing and things around the country, we in the U.S. did a U.S. unilateral contribution to the 3 Baltic states and moved F-15s from Lakenheath into the Baltic nations. Pretty proud. 18 hours go to show. Go. 18 hours later, we had armed airplanes over the top of the nations and a force that could regenerate and sustain those. So yes, there are things we can do, and we can do things on the ground as well. And our naval components that are there, the 4 destroyers that are in the Med, going into the Black Sea to do freedom of navigation and other things. There are lots of things we could do. And I think you saw the U.S. announced it's moving fighters now forward. So we not only have Army units on alert, but now we've moved fighters forward to the Baltic nations to enhance air policing. And let me just make one last personal plea. I've argued a long time against air policing. Air policing is a peacetime function for renegade aircraft. We should be changing NATO now into an air defense posture. Give our aviators the rules of engagement and the special instructions that would allow them to respond to a bellicose action, which is not air policing. So sorry for stealing your time, but I'm still an advocate for moving NATO's air policing forces into an air defense posture.
That's the next evolution. We've went from European Reassurance Initiative to European Deterrence Initiative. Maybe this is an easy change we can make in semantics to better signal our credibility. But General Clark, please.
So first of all, I really appreciate what General Breedlove just said. It just underscores my point about putting that air power into Romania with the right mission. But the larger question that you're referencing, the national defense strategy and so forth that's coming out, I have to be very candid and tell you I've been concerned from the beginning, because although I think it would be wonderful if we could stabilize relations with Russia and focus on China, I've never thought it was particularly feasible. The Russians ran the buildup in the spring, and that was when it first started. And then President Biden met with President Putin in Geneva and said, "It's up to you. We'd like stable relationship with you." And Mr. Putin has said no. Look, this is very consistent with everything Mr. Putin said since he was the intelligence chief and later the prime minister, even before he became president. He's wanted Ukraine back. He's wanted to restore the Soviet Union. You can't believe that he's going to sit by idly and say, "Oh, okay, I really do like the Americans. Yeah, we'll keep a small Russia just to be good neighbors to everyone." He's probably not going to do that. So I think what we're looking at is an understanding emerging out of this, that stabilizing Europe is not as easy as we thought. It's going to require more forces. It's going to require more attention. And frankly, you can't deal as America or NATO with China and an assertive China unless you have a strong, unified Europe in support. This is the essential weight that we need. Europe today is the grand strategic prize. Russia wants it so it can later face off against China. China wants it because it knows if it has it, that the United States won't be able to really challenge it economically. The United States more or less has it because of NATO and 70 years of heritage and the results of World War II. And when we started talking in 2011 about pivoting to Asia, right away I became concerned, because you can't turn your back on Europe. They're our closest partners. They're going to be our closest partners. And no matter how important the nations that are developing and growing in Southeast Asia are, Vietnam and Malaysia and all of that, Indonesia, it's still our base, at least for the next decade and a half, 2 decades, has to be Europe. And so, this is a wake-up call for American geostrategy, in my view.
And do you think it's a wake-up call for European NATO as well?
Well, I certainly hope it will be. But, again, as General Breedlove and I were saying, these nations all have their internal politics and their internal interests. They don't want to go against China. Look, right now, Germany is pressuring Lithuania because Lithuania is trying to do deals with Taiwan. And China has come to Germany and said, hey, you want to work with us? You better put your little neighbor in place. And so there's all this internal dynamic. This is the stuff of diplomacy, politics, and alliances. It goes on all the time behind the scenes, and we have to be attentive to it and work it. It requires using every tool in the toolkit: economic policy, diplomacy, international law, trade policy, and military deployments. And one of the problems we've had over the decades of the Cold War is the United States has more or less disconnected its national security policy from so many other tools in the tool basket, including financial policy. And during the Cold War, we actually thought that if American businesses went abroad and built businesses, they would create American values. But some of these businesses today think that they're major actors themselves and don't need American support. And so all of this has to be sort of worked, massaged, correlated, brought together to enable the United States to succeed in a multipolar world, the challenges of Russia and China.
All right, thank you. I think I'll turn to General Breedlove next. It strikes me that the U.S. administration is evidently trying to work through NATO to find solutions to the crisis and to bolster any U.S. Assets in the region. The announcement that the United States would put units on hire to deploy orders and would operate through the NATO response force, which is obviously something that was bolstered a lot during your time in the post-Crimea situation in NATO. So I wonder if you could comment on what are some of the options that NATO, the alliance, can take beyond what the United States and some individual members have announced. Obviously, after the Russia attack and invasion of Ukraine in 2014, NATO's significant step was to bolster presence in the Baltic states and Poland through the enhanced forward presence. So I'm not telling you anything you don't already know, but those forces are small, about 1,500 each, maybe about 4,000 in Poland if you also count the other U.S. forces there. And these forces weren't there before 2014. You're looking at the map that is Europe. What would you as SACEUR now push for? You've already mentioned air policing to air defense. What do the equivalents look like for the other domains?
Yeah, let's get our eyes off our feet and up on the horizon for just a second, and then I'll get to those. General Clark hit it on the nail on the head immediately right up front. The most important thing NATO needs to do right now is solidarity, is making sure that we present a united front in both policy and action to Russia. So we need to work on that internal solidarity. Second of all, we talked about it just a couple of minutes ago. NATO writ large needs to look at those options that would tell Mr. Putin that he's going to get opposite of what he asked for. Raising the alert status of forces, possibly moving elements of the very high readiness joint task force, other things to improve our positioning in the forward area will again send that message we talked about earlier that you're going to get exactly opposite of what you wanted if we continue this bellicose stance. And frankly, this all sounds very hawkish, but along the track of both, we need to keep dialogue moving. I congratulate the current administration that we're still in dialogue. And in fact, I guess as a result of the last day or two, we may have actually found a few things that we can talk about. We don't want to fight. I don't really think he wants to fight, but this whole business means a lot more to him than some of us. And so we have to have that in our calculus. And let me just say one thing that General Clark just brought up, which I think is really important. He talked about the toolbox. Frankly, this is something I teach a lot about at Georgia Tech's Sam Nunn School. In America, we tend to be sort of stovepiped in our responses. To radical Islam, we use steel and tritonol, bombs, and we try to eliminate those problems primarily via our military instrument. When we deal with Russia in the past, it's almost all been in our economic cylinder of excellence. Sanctions, additional sanctions, wider sanctions, deeper sanctions, special sanctions, very special sanctions. But a nation has more in its toolkit. A very simple diagram I use for fighter pilots, we need simplicity and repetition, is DIME. We have diplomatic power, informational power, military power, and economic power. And I think we should be more balanced in our reply. An all of nation, all of government, or all of alliance reply using all the tools rather than the stovepipes we have with radical Islam, the stovepipe we have with Russia, etc. Sorry for
Leah, if I could come in on what General Breedlove said and give a couple of examples.
As long as you're not in violent agreement again.
We're always in agreement, I think, on these things. But look, in 1999, when I was a NATO Supreme Commander, Mr. Putin went from being the intelligence minister and the intelligence czar into becoming the prime minister. And there were some mysterious bombings that were attributed to the Chechens in Moscow. And it turned out that actually in one apartment building, the residents who were so worried about this wave of bombings, they were checking their own building. They discovered, yes, there were bombs set there. And they actually called the government agencies, and the government agencies said, oh, my goodness, these are our own explosives, but thank you very much for detecting them. And you know, a whole book has been written and there's been investigations on this. Look, Mr. Putin, with 99% assurance, was in charge of setting the bombs, blaming it on the Chechens to justify renewing the war against Chechnya to make him a hero to become the president. This was done with the connivance of Russian intelligence. Now, this was discussed over the years, but it's never really been made much of. And yet, you know that there's a Russian disinformation campaign against our country and our leadership. What are we telling the Russian people about their president? Have they forgotten about this? There's all kinds of information available that strongly suggests that he did this. And so that's one sort of information, part of the information toolkit that could be used. I'll give you another one. No one mentions Kaliningrad. And yet Kaliningrad is German territory. It was East Prussia. It was seized by Russia at the end of the Second World War. It's a thumb sticking into NATO's eye that has 2 Russian divisions, SA-400s, nuclear Iskander missiles, and so forth. Look, why don't we complain about that? I mean, I think that's really offensive. And why don't we then say, if you don't pull some of that out, we're not going to do this. We're not going to give you the technology trade you want. We're not going to provide the loans from the banks that you want. This is sticking right into Denmark and Finland and Sweden and Germany and Poland. And it's very threatening to us since you've behaved the way you behaved in Ukraine. We don't know what you might do next. So, you know, you can continue this. You don't have to be passive in this. And we should start this kind of dialogue and use these kind of toolkits to restore some balance in this relationship. We're looking for a stable relationship with Russia, but you can't overlook what they're doing and simply ask for their help while they do things that create the threat and the instability that we're working against.
Be more proactive as we can in our responses. It's not natural, though, especially in the information space, for us transparent and liberal democracies, at least. We're nearing the end, about 10 minutes left. So please, if you've got questions, drop them into Zoom or tweet us at AC Scowcraft or using the Stronger with Allies hashtag. I have a couple audience questions already that I'd like to pose to both of you. First one I want to address is from Pascal Siegel. He asks, can Russia sustain its heightened posture on the borders of Ukraine for a long time and without pressure US and NATO into negotiating on his terms? So basically, what timeline are we looking at? Is this something that by mid-February, if we haven't seen an invasion, is it done?
Well, the obvious timelines are well discussed. First of all, this costs a lot of money. And Russia doesn't have a lot of money to be throwing around like this. And so the longer those forces are there, the more it costs them and the more morale problems they have. The other timeline that General Clark could better discuss is the frozen ground issue that we talk so much about. Yes, the Russian military can attack any time of the year, but the frozen ground gives them a better time and capability for large armored formations. But as General Clark talked about earlier, the way this war will start is probably not going to start with large armored formations. Those may come, but there'll be other actions happening. So there are a couple of timelines that are well discussed that sort of say that it's a use it or lose it. I'm not so sanguine with that, but I understand the thoughts.
Maybe General Clark, you were just speaking about options that the West, so to speak, could take to make noise and complain about actions that Russia has taken. NATO has responded back to Russia's list of demands with a list of demands of their own. One of those is seen by many as a non-starter to Russia, which would be for them to stop invading Ukraine and Georgia, etc. We have a question from Victor Rudd that I think plays on this nicely too. He says that Russia has taken and kept the initiative and pressing NATO's 30 members plus other Western democracies against the ropes for years. So what has to change, or to maybe add on that, like what would signal de-escalation to you, General Clark?
Well, I think you have to do a better job of coordinating the toolkit. In other words, we don't want to go to the Russian tactics of trying to use military threats against Russia. We don't, as General Breedlove said, we don't want a war, and no one wants a war less than the generals who've been in them. But I can tell you that we've got lots of tools that can be used against Russia. The financial tool, the banking tool, the purchasing of the development of an alternative energy strategy for Europe that would strengthen US-European relations based on liquefied natural gas shipments. It would be a fantastic program that could be put together. It may take a couple of years, but just announcing that program and starting to work on that program, that's a powerful warning to Russia that has nothing to do with the military. And so if you want to take the initiative, you have to think strategically. The thing about democracies is we respond to our domestic problems. That's how presidents get elected. They don't get elected by promising some grand strategic design against Russia. And so presidents are and prime ministers and others are looking at their domestic situation. So we have to find a way better for NATO as an alliance of democracies to harness the full toolkit to offset the military threat that comes from Russia. They don't have the toolkit except, as General Breedlove mentioned, energy. That's their principal toolkit. We've got multiple means that we can use.
And Lee, let me add one other slant and take a little umbrage with something you said. The word you use makes it sound like because we're a liberal democracy, we can't fight the information fight. I don't agree with that at all. We don't have to lie. We simply have to tell the truth, tell it vigorously, and we have to tell it at threat speed, which is our biggest problem. We are not organized in our country to answer threat speed. I don't have time to go through my spiel, but how long did it take the United States to answer the MH17 shoot down? It's a trick question. We never did. We threw it over the transom and allowed the Dutch and the Malaysians to answer it. And that was 2 years later, and Russia was already on to 9 more new lies in those 2 years. So I think that the tool that we are really missing is the opportunity to enter into the information warfare spaces at threat speed. We built the GEC to try to do that, and you've seen how that has gone. But we need to organize a way other than National Security Council meetings to address the information warfare at threat speed. I said it 3 times.
Point taken. Thank you very much. I think, do you see the British example of the release of intelligence that they had on Russian aims to overthrow leadership in Kiev as an example of that? I think it's also read politically, though, around Europe that, again, the US and the UK are maybe warmongering or too alarmist in this. You've already commented on how the Ukraine leadership is in a tough spot right now, needing to message certainty and calm to their populace so as not to lead to even further crisis. But what else can maybe NATO as an organization be doing? Stoltenberg is out there all the time in the press with a very calculated message. Is there more that the institution can be doing to identify disinformation, et cetera? Yes.
Well, I was going to let my colleague answer. I don't want to be dominating the conversation here. So.
No, what you said is exactly right. We don't have the right framework within NATO or within our democracies to answer the information challenge at threat speed. Remember, this is a challenge that really began in the 1920s when Lenin put together the Comintern, the Communist International that was designed to sow confusion and create subversion across all Western nations. It was very powerful in Germany. He's still very powerful through exchange programs and stuff. And, we have people who served in the U.S. Armed Forces, I'm not going to name them, who seem to have fallen prey to this kind of a Russian outreach. So, we can do a lot more in this area. But Leah, I was just looking, we've got lots of these questions, and how do we answer these wonderful people who are asking the questions? And, I'm sure, Phil and I are watching this dialogue. It's kind of hard to follow the questions and type.
No, please don't worry about that. We've got our people behind the scenes filtering them to me on a fancy Google Doc over here. So I've thrown you guys a couple already. Maybe just a few minutes left. I'll also throw you one that I think it's something that both of you could speak on for hours and hours, but maybe if we can try and keep it as brief as possible. Dries Larafi asks, with China's huge military, can the United States still afford to sustain and wield its influence on both fronts, Europe versus Russia and the Indo-Pacific versus China?
The United States will do what it has to do if the information is provided to the American public. One of the things that pulls both parties together is national security. And yes, there's always been a difference. I mean, the Democrats have always said, hey, can't we negotiate? And the Republicans have always said, let's build up our power before we do so. But there's a common foundation here, and it is the security of the United States. So we have to have our own information policy. We have to talk about this. And I think this crisis on Ukraine is an excellent opportunity for the American people to become more engaged in national security. When I grew up in the 1950s, the awareness of the Soviet threat was everywhere. We had even Premier Khrushchev came to the United States and said, we communists will bury you. He went to the United Nations, took his shoe off and pounded on the podium with it in 1961. There was a Berlin crisis, the Cuban crisis. Young people today don't see it. And so it doesn't mobilize public opinion the same way. But with this Ukraine crisis, one of Putin's big mistakes is the Western democracies will mobilize their publics against it. And this is an opportunity for us.
And if I could just take a little different slant, again, agreeing with General Clark, this, I think, points to the importance of alliances. We've went through a period where people in America were sort of looking down at alliances. I think NATO is more important today and into the next 70 years than it was in the past 70 years. And the same goes in the Pacific. No, we don't have structures like NATO over there, but friends and allies are going to be key to what America can do into the future. And some of our friends and allies in the Pacific region are very strong very capable, not only militarily, but financially and in economies. And so this is the important thing. We cannot turn in so much that we lose contact with those who are going to help us in the future. Alliances, allies, friends, and partners around the world are going to become key to America being able to sustain the kind of peace that we believe is important for our world.
Thank you so much, both. That was a really great note, I think, to end on, especially here at the Atlantic Council, where everything we do is looking at U.S. global leadership in partnership with allies and critical to everything that we do here. So I thank you both so much for joining us on our virtual stage here. This is much more conversation to follow and to be continued, but I know I will be definitely looking for your analysis on these issues as we move forward with so much uncertainty surrounding the crisis. So on behalf of the Atlantic Council and the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, as well as the Eurasia Center, thank you everyone for tuning in online and have a great day.
Great to be with you, Bill.
Yes, sir. Thanks a lot. I thought that went rather well.